Stefan had never questioned the way he lived. His parents, Daniel and Lisa Hartman, provided everything he needed, never too much, never too little. Their modest suburban home in Ohio was comfortable but unremarkable. Their 2 cars were functional rather than luxurious, and vacations were occasional road trips rather than extravagant overseas getaways. It was a life of balance, where hard work was valued, and every dollar spent was considered carefully. Stefan's childhood had been filled with the kind of normalcy that left little room for speculation. His father worked in what he vaguely understood to be financial consulting, while his mother managed a small bookstore. Their family had no obvious wealth, no private schools, no extravagant gifts. Stefan had worked part-time jobs through high school, bagging groceries and delivering pizzas, never once suspecting that his life was anything but ordinary. By the time he turned 20, he was in his second year of college, studying economics at a state university. He wasn't the top student, but he worked hard enough to maintain decent grades. He lived in a small off-campus apartment with a roommate, relying on a combination of his part-time job and careful budgeting. He had dreams of one day working in finance, maybe climbing the corporate ladder, securing a future where he wouldn't have to check his bank balance before buying a cup of coffee. Then, on the morning of his 20th birthday, his parents asked him to come home for the weekend. There was something about their request, too formal, too insistent, that put him on edge. But he went anyway, assuming it was just a family tradition he had forgotten. What they told him that evening shattered everything he thought he knew. His parents had been lying to him, not out of malice, but out of necessity, or so they believed. The Hartmans were millionaires, with assets stretching beyond anything Stefan had ever imagined. His father, far from being an ordinary consultant, was a major investor with holdings in multiple companies. His mother's bookstore, a seemingly quaint passion project, was just one of many businesses they owned. They had built their fortune before he was even born, but they had hidden it from him deliberately. Their reasoning was simple. They wanted Stefan to grow up without entitlement, to learn the value of money, to struggle just enough to appreciate success when he earned it. And now, on his 20th birthday, they decided it was time to tell him the truth. The trust fund in his name? It had been waiting for him all along, a safety net he never knew existed. The revelation left him reeling. His entire perception of his past, his struggles, his ambitions. Suddenly, none of it made sense. Had every hardship been a test? Had his parents watched him work minimum-wage jobs, knowing he never needed to? The thought of it unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. His first instinct was to reject it, to pretend he hadn't heard them. But curiosity gnawed at him. If they had hidden this from him for so long, what else had they not told him? What kind of wealth were they really talking about? He needed to see for himself. That night, unable to sleep, Stefan did something he had never done before. He searched his father's name online, something he had never thought to do because his father had always seemed like just another working professional. The results stunned him. Articles, business profiles, financial reports. His father wasn't just wealthy. He was a recognized figure in the investment world. Names of corporations he had heard of in passing were linked to his father's portfolio. Then he found something stranger. An old article, buried among the rest. It was from more than 2 decades ago, before he was born. The details were vague, but it mentioned a lawsuit. Something about fraud accusations that were later dismissed. His father had been involved, but the case had disappeared as quickly as it had surfaced. Stefan frowned, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Something didn't feel right. The more he searched, the more inconsistencies he found. His father's company records were clean, too clean, as if someone had meticulously scrubbed them. His mother's businesses, too, seemed strangely structured. Some closed down and reopened under new names. Others sold and repurchased under different entities. The questions kept piling up. Why had his parents really hidden their wealth? And what else were they hiding? Something told him this was only the beginning. Stefan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The more he thought about it, the less sense it made. His parents had told him they hid their wealth to ensure he grew up with a strong work ethic. But if that were true, why did it feel like they had gone to extreme lengths to conceal their past? The erased lawsuits, the odd business transactions, the near-total absence of financial records prior to his birth. It was as if they had deliberately erased their history before starting over. He had spent the night tossing and turning, his mind spinning with possibilities. What if his parents weren't just wealthy, but hiding something bigger? And if they had lied about this, what else had they kept from him? By morning, he had made up his mind. He wouldn't get any more answers from them, not yet. If they had kept a secret this big for 20 years, they weren't going to give up any deeper truths just because he started asking questions. He needed to find out for himself. Instead of returning to campus that afternoon, he made a detour. His first stop was the county records office, a beige building tucked between a post office and a government facility. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and dust, and the room was lined with shelves stacked with manila folders. A few employees sat behind a desk, barely looking up as he entered. Stefan approached the counter and, in the calmest voice he could manage, requested documents on legal cases involving his father's name. The woman at the desk gave him a disinterested glance before directing him to a public access computer in the corner. He sat down and began typing. At first, there was nothing of interest: corporate filings, tax disputes, mundane financial dealings. But then he found it. The case from 22 years ago. It wasn't just fraud. It was embezzlement. His breath caught as he clicked on the report. The case had accused his father's company of siphoning millions from investors. Funds had gone missing over the course of several years before an investigation was launched. The numbers were staggering, amounts far beyond what Stefan had imagined. But what stood out the most was the abrupt way the case had been closed. The charges had vanished. No official explanation. There was no record of a trial, no details on why the case had been dismissed. It was as if someone had wiped the entire thing clean, leaving only whispers in the system. Stefan's pulse quickened. His entire life, he had admired his father for his intelligence, his discipline, his work ethic. But what if it had all been a lie? What if the wealth they had hidden from him wasn't just a lesson in humility, but a necessity to keep something darker buried? A new question formed in his mind, one even more unsettling. If his father had been guilty, who had helped him escape? And why had the case disappeared? Determined to keep digging, Stefan wrote down the names of the attorneys and key figures mentioned in the case files. One name stood out: Thomas Whitaker, the prosecutor originally assigned to the case. If anyone knew what had really happened, it would be him. He searched for Whitaker's name online, expecting to find law firm listings or government positions. Instead, he found nothing recent. The last mention of him was in a small, local news article from 8 years ago. He had left law unexpectedly and disappeared from the public eye. His last known address was an hour away, in a small town Stefan had never heard of. The logical part of his brain told him to slow down. He had barely processed what he had just learned, and now he was chasing down a man he had never met, looking for answers he wasn't sure he wanted. But he couldn't stop himself. He got into his car and started driving. The road stretched long and empty as he left the city limits, heading into unfamiliar territory. Trees thickened along the roadside, the landscape growing quieter with each passing mile. When he finally arrived at the address, it was a small, unremarkable house with an overgrown yard. The paint on the porch was peeling, and the mailbox leaned at an awkward angle. Stefan hesitated before stepping out of his car. The house looked abandoned, but a faint light glowed from one of the windows. He took a breath and walked up the steps, his shoes crunching against the dry leaves scattered across the wooden boards. Before he could knock, the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, older than Stefan had expected. His gray hair was disheveled, his face worn, but his eyes were sharp. He studied Stefan for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. Something in the way the man looked at him sent a shiver down Stefan's spine. It was as if he had been expecting him. And then, before Stefan could say a word, the man spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The door slammed shut. Stefan stood motionless on the porch, his mind racing. The door had shut in his face, but the weight of Whitaker's expression lingered in his thoughts. There had been something in the man's eyes, recognition, maybe even regret. He knew something, and he wasn't about to share it. The logical thing would have been to leave, but Stefan wasn't ready to walk away. He stepped back and scanned the property, searching for another way in. The house was small, the roof sagging at the edges, but it wasn't abandoned. A dim light glowed from one of the back windows, and through the curtain, a shadow moved. Whitaker was still inside, watching him. Instead of knocking again, Stefan circled around the house. The backyard was in disrepair. Tangled weeds, a collapsed wooden fence, and a rusted-out shed tucked in the corner. The shed's door was ajar, swaying slightly with the breeze. It didn't match the rest of the neglected yard. Someone had been inside recently. Stefan approached cautiously, glancing back at the house. He wasn't sure why, but his pulse quickened as he reached for the shed door and nudged it open. The scent of damp wood and old paper filled the air. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, unlit, but enough moonlight filtered through the broken boards to reveal the clutter inside. Stacks of old furniture, forgotten boxes, at first glance, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, in the far corner, he spotted something different. A desk. Unlike the rest of the shed, the desk wasn't covered in dust. Someone had been using it recently. Papers were strewn across the surface, and a laptop sat closed but plugged in. A few files were stacked neatly at the side, as if someone had been organizing them before being interrupted. Stefan stepped closer, his breath unsteady. He flipped through the papers, scanning the pages. Court filings, financial records, names he recognized, his father's company, the fraud case, and then something worse. A list of transactions. Stefan's fingers tightened around the paper. The figures were staggering, millions of dollars shifting between offshore accounts, their origins obscured by layers of shell companies. His father's name appeared in multiple places, but others he didn't recognize stood out as well. At the bottom of the document, a note was scrawled in red ink. They think it's buried, but money always leaves a trail. Stefan's stomach clenched. This wasn't just about hidden wealth. His father had been part of something much bigger, something deliberately concealed. A rustling sound outside snapped him back to reality. Someone was approaching. He barely had time to react before a sharp creak echoed through the shed. The door swung open wider, casting a long shadow against the dim interior. Stefan spun, his heart pounding. Whitaker stood in the doorway. The old man's face was unreadable, but his presence was enough to send a clear message. Stefan had stepped into something he wasn't supposed to find. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. Then Whitaker took a step forward, his eyes flicking toward the papers Stefan had been reading. His expression darkened, but not with surprise. With something else. Resignation. Stefan didn't know what to do. If he left now, would Whitaker let him? If he stayed, would he get the answers he was searching for? His instincts told him that, whatever was happening here, it was far more dangerous than he had realized. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to know the truth. The tension inside the shed was suffocating. Whitaker stood just inside the doorway, his gaze locked onto the scattered documents. The dim light did little to soften his expression. His face, worn with age, held something closer to exhaustion than anger. He wasn't surprised to see Stefan there, nor did he seem startled that the files had been discovered. If anything, he looked resigned, as if he had known this moment would come eventually. Stefan's pulse pounded in his ears as he tried to piece everything together. The papers in front of him weren't just remnants of an old case. They were evidence of something much bigger. The missing money, the offshore accounts, the notes scribbled in red ink. It all pointed to a trail that hadn't gone cold. His father's past hadn't simply been buried. Someone had been digging. The old prosecutor's presence only confirmed his suspicions. If Whitaker had truly left the legal world behind, why did he have these files? Why had he kept the records instead of letting them fade into obscurity? The fact that he still had them meant there was something unfinished, something unresolved. A gust of wind rattled the shed door. The outside world felt impossibly far away. Whitaker stepped toward the desk and reached for one of the papers. He didn't even glance at Stefan. His focus was entirely on the numbers and names that filled the page. He seemed to study them, tracing over details that he must have already known by heart. Stefan felt like an intruder in a moment he didn't fully understand. He had come here searching for answers, but now that he stood in the middle of them, they felt heavier than he had anticipated. This wasn't just about hidden wealth or a family secret. This was about a crime that had never been punished, a fortune that had been carefully concealed, and the people who had allowed it to happen. The weight of it settled deep in his chest. For years, he had believed his parents had hidden their wealth to protect him from entitlement, to teach him the value of hard work. But that wasn't the full truth. They had hidden their wealth because it couldn't be exposed. It had been built on something that couldn't withstand scrutiny. Whitaker placed the document back on the desk with careful precision, as if putting a piece back into a puzzle. He moved with the deliberation of someone who had spent years living in the shadows of old decisions, bound to secrets that were never fully buried. Stefan's thoughts spun wildly. If the money was still traceable, if these records still existed, that meant someone, somewhere, had let it happen. Maybe it had been swept under the rug decades ago, but there were always people who remembered. There were always people who knew. He felt an overwhelming urge to leave. The shed, once just a forgotten structure in an overgrown yard, now felt like a tomb for things that should have stayed hidden. The papers, the accounts, the buried transactions. They were all part of a story that was never meant to be reopened. Stefan turned toward the door, his movements stiff. He needed to think. He needed distance. But as he stepped outside, the cool air offering no real relief, a new realization settled over him. If he had found this, if Whitaker had kept this, then someone else had been looking too. Nothing this large remained buried forever. The rustling of trees filled the silence as he walked away from the shed, his mind racing with possibilities. The implications were staggering. If his father had escaped justice once, what would happen if the truth resurfaced now? There were too many pieces that didn't fit. The case had disappeared, but the money had never been returned. Someone had closed the investigation, but the evidence still existed. And Whitaker, whether he had meant to or not, had left a trail. Stefan reached his car and hesitated. His reflection in the window looked unfamiliar, his expression harder than he remembered. The events of the last 24 hours had shifted something inside him. He had always thought he was in control of his future, that his struggles had shaped him into someone who understood the value of success. But his life hadn't been shaped by struggle alone. It had been shaped by decisions made long before he was born. There was no undoing the past. The only question was what he was going to do with what he had learned. The house behind him remained eerily quiet, the shed filled with its secrets, the documents sitting untouched on the desk. Whitaker hadn't tried to stop him from seeing them. He hadn't destroyed them, either. That meant something. Stefan gripped the steering wheel as the weight of the truth settled into place. Everything he had once believed about his life had been rewritten. And now, for the first time, he had a choice to make. He started the car, the engine rumbling to life. Then, without looking back, he drove away. Stefan drove in silence, the road stretching ahead in the darkness. His hands gripped the wheel, his mind racing through everything he had just uncovered. The documents, the offshore accounts, the buried case. His father's hidden fortune wasn't just a secret. It was a crime. And now, he wasn't sure if he was the only one digging into it. For the first time, he wondered if someone else had been watching him. Had his search triggered something? Had his father already realized he knew too much? Had Whitaker's shed been searched before? The questions piled on top of one another, each more unsettling than the last. When he finally pulled into the parking lot of his apartment building, his body felt heavy, drained from the weight of the truth. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he stepped out of the car. He glanced around instinctively, scanning the dark corners of the lot, his paranoia growing. Inside his apartment, his roommate wasn't home. The place was quiet, empty, but it didn't feel safe. Not anymore. Stefan grabbed his laptop and sat at his desk, pulling up everything he had found so far. The articles about his father, the court records, the financial documents. He spread them across the screen, staring at the evidence as if looking at it all at once would make it easier to process. There was one thing he hadn't done yet. One thing he had been too afraid to do. He opened a new search. He typed in Whitaker's name, this time looking for anything recent. The first few results were nothing new. Old legal cases, news reports from years ago. But then, buried between irrelevant links, he found something strange. A local news story from just last year. The article was brief, barely more than a paragraph. It mentioned an anonymous tip that had led authorities to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Inside, investigators had found documents related to an old financial fraud case, one that had been dismissed decades ago. The case was never reopened. The evidence had disappeared, and the man who had submitted the tip had vanished before anyone could question him. Stefan stared at the screen, his breath shallow. Whitaker hadn't just kept the files. He had tried to expose them before, and someone had stopped him. A sharp knock at the door sent a shock through his system. Stefan snapped his laptop shut, his pulse hammering. He stayed still, listening. The knock came again, heavier this time. He checked his phone. No messages, no missed calls. No one had told him they were coming. He stood and moved carefully toward the door, pressing his eye against the peephole. A man in a dark coat stood outside. Stefan had never seen him before. He wasn't a neighbor, wasn't anyone from his school. The man's posture was stiff, his hands in his pockets, waiting. Stefan didn't move. He barely breathed. A long moment passed before the man finally turned and walked away. Stefan remained frozen until he heard the faint sound of a car door closing, followed by an engine starting. He moved cautiously toward the window, peering through the blinds. A black sedan rolled out of the parking lot and disappeared down the street. His stomach twisted. That hadn't been a coincidence. He turned back to his laptop, his mind working faster than his fear. If Whitaker had tried to bring the truth to light before, that meant there was more to this than just a hidden fortune. Someone had been watching. Someone had been waiting for anyone who got too close. And now, they knew about him. Stefan didn't sleep that night. He packed a bag, stuffing it with only what he needed. Laptop, phone, charger, a few clothes. He didn't have a plan yet, but he knew he couldn't stay in his apartment. By sunrise, he was back in his car, heading out of town. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew one thing for certain. Whoever had been protecting his father's secrets, they weren't finished yet. And neither was he.